Innovation, imagination, wonder. These are just some of the words used to describe Dr. Harvey Passes. Dr. Passes explores interesting people and ideas that will stimulate you. He questions the people who develop, create, and employ novel concepts in business and everyday lives. He especially loves to speak with successful people. How did they do it? How can you do it too? So let's join Dr. Harvey Passes in his quest of wonder and curiosity as we watch Dr. Harvey Passes Presents.
Have I got a great story for you today? Let's get right down to it. New Year's Eve, this past New Year's Eve, 2005, some friends came over to our home for dinner, and they know of my love of good food and wine. And among the different things they brought is just nice little gifts. They brought me a book. And they said, you must read this book. And I said, well, it's very nice. Thank you very much. And I put the book on the side, and I just forgot about it. And then I remembered a few days later about this book. I picked up the book and I started looking at it, and I was absolutely blown away, to coin a phrase. I was just blown away by what I read. I read a story about something monumental that happened in the world of wine, May 24th, 1976. And it was earth-shaking. To anyone in the world of wine would know that this was the day that the rest of the world decided to really jump in and get involved in producing good, high-quality wine around the world. So if you're a wine fanatic, or even if you just enjoy wine, this show is for you today, because you're going to meet an individual who happened to have been at the place where everything just turned around for the rest of the world in wine. And this gentleman, he is an author, and he was also a journalist for Time magazine. And this gentleman's name is George Tabor. George, I want to thank you very much for coming down and bringing your book with you, and for graciously accepting my invitation to discuss your book.
Great. Harvey, I'm very delighted to be here.
Oh, it's just terrific. I've had many conversations with you, loved everything we've discussed. We have this passion, so we can spend hours talking to each other about it.
Wine brings out passion.
It does.
I've discovered that.
Absolutely, which is great. So let's get down to this first of all. What is so special that happened May 24th, 1976? Tell the folks at home.
Well, there was a blind tasting, which meant that the judges, there were 9 judges, the most eminent people in the French wine establishment. There was a tasting of California wines and French wines.
Mm-hmm. Where?
In Paris.
In Paris.
And that's very important that they were French judges. It was in Paris, and also it was a blind tasting. So they didn't know what they were tasting. They knew they were California, and they knew they were French. And there were 2 categories of wines: Bordeaux-style Cabernet Sauvignon, mm-hmm. and white Burgundy Chardonnay. Mm-hmm. And in both categories, the California wines won, to the surprise, shock, horror of the French judges. These judges said on that day the best wines, and the French wines were the best that France could have put up. The red category, for example, there were 2 of what are called the first gross from the 1865 collection and selection, and 2 of what they call the super second gross. So these were just outstanding French wines. On the white side, they were equally just the best that France could have.
And let me interject. Up until that time, France was considered the king of wine in the world.
Absolutely.
Right? They ruled the world.
Yeah. What happened before that really was that France was on a pedestal. There were French wines, and then there was everybody else.
Right.
And everybody else was making what they call plonk.
Plonk, right.
Especially in California. California wines at this point were the Rodney Dangerfield of world wines. They didn't get any respect. But after that, just in that one day, the reputation of California wines changed. And as a lot of people told me when I was researching the book, the aspirations of winemakers around the world changed, because they said to themselves, hey, if the Californians can do it, if the Californians can turn out as good a wines and even better wines than the French, hey, I can do the same thing in Italy or South Africa or Australia, Chile,
anywhere.
Or others in California. So it really was a revolutionary day in the history of wine.
Okay, let's get into some of the details, because this was such a great story. First, I want to compliment you. Not only in your book did you tell the story, but your writing is so compelling, even if you don't give a hoot about wine. You will enjoy reading the book. You just want to keep turning the page. So my compliments to you as a writer and obviously as a researcher, because the information you have in this book, you read this book, you will understand wine. There's no question about it. So my hat's off to you on that, George.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind of you.
So let's move on now. The story begins with Stephen Spurrier. Who is Stephen Spurrier?
Crazy set of circumstances. Everything, in a lot of ways in the book, everything is a crazy set of circumstances.
It seems that way.
Stephen Spurrier was an Englishman who had a wine school and a wine shop in Paris.
How many British owned wine shops in France?
I'm sure he was the only one.
Right.
And he'd started the only wine school. There had never been a wine school in Paris. Can you believe it? There had never been a wine school in Paris until
Especially given by someone who's not French.
Exactly.
Okay.
But at the same time, although he was not French, he was very respected by the French wine establishment. He had what is called a good palate. He was a great wine taster. He's probably one of the best wine tasters in the world. So they had a great respect for him. So that when he came up with this idea of a tasting of Californian French wines, the members of the French wine establishment thought nothing of saying, oh, sure, I'll come to Stephen Spurrier's tasting. And if it had been somebody else, if it had been George Tabor's tasting, nobody would have come. To Stephen Spurrier, they came, and they were willing to.
And big names came.
Very big names. It was the editor of the Revue de Vin de France, which was the only French wine publication at that point, the sommeliers of 3 of France's top restaurants, the winemakers, in fact, the owners of 2 of the...
Alexis Lachine?
Yes. I mean, Alexis Lachine actually was not one of the judges.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought he was.
No.
Okay.
But the head of the Domaine de Romanée-Conti, Aubert de Villain, which is considered to be the best vineyard in France, was one of the judges. So, I mean, these were the best judges, the best French wine.
Okay, so now we've got this thing set up, and he really did this basically just to promote his wine shop.
Yeah.
He wasn't looking to do anything to set the world on fire.
First of all, he wanted to make sure that the French wines won that day, because as he told me later, he said, I had a wine shop and a wine business in France. I didn't want to offend my host.
Okay.
So when he went down selecting the wines to compete with the American wines, he selected French wines that he thought would win.
Hands down. He thought. Okay, now, he sent out invitations for the press to be there. How much press showed up?
Only one. First of all, everybody, including myself, turned down the invitation to come.
And you worked for Time Magazine at the time.
I was a Time Magazine correspondent in Paris. I'd been there for a little over 3 years.
Okay.
And like everybody else, when I got the invitation, I said, hey, this is what journalists call a non-story. I mean, nothing's going to happen there. Who cares if there's a wine tasting and the French wines win? It's not a story.
It's dog bites man.
Exactly. That's what it looked like. But it also turned out to be a man-by-dog story.
Oh, well, wait a minute. Why did you go? You turned out to be the only person to be there.
It was because
the only press.
Yes, it was because of a second invitation I got to attend it. I had taken the introduction to French wine that Stephen gave at his wine school, the course. And about a week before the event, they remembered that I had taken the course, so they called me and basically begged me to come to the event, saying, no, we're holding this event, no press is coming, could you come? And so I said, well, if I don't have anything more important to do that day, sure. I had grown up in California, and I was always interested in California wines, local pride and all that stuff. So I thought, gee, it might be an interesting way to spend an afternoon.
Right.
Fortunately for me, nothing more important did come up that day, and so I went to the event.
Okay, so now you're at the event, and just tell us what happens. The judges are beginning to taste the whites first. Exactly. And they're all speaking French, and you speak French.
Right.
And you're listening and walking around. Did you notice anything unusual happening here?
Well, one of the most important things was that since I was the only journalist there that day,
yes,
I had total freedom to roam around the room. I had been given the list of the wine. So the judges didn't know what wine they were tasting, but I knew what wine they were tasting. And since I did speak French, I'd been working at this point, we were working or studying in French-speaking countries at this point for 7 years. So my French was pretty good at that point, so not quite as good now. But I was able to roam. I was able to listen to their conversation.
Right. And understand it.
And understand it as they talked about the wine. And about midway through the white wine tasting, I noticed something that absolutely shocked me.
What?
They were getting confused. They couldn't tell the difference between a French wine and a California wine. There was just one classic moment when Raymond Oliver, the owner of the Grand Véfour restaurant, held a wine glass like this. It was a white wine glass. Up to the light, he looked at it, and then he smelled it. And he tasted it, and he said, "Ah, back to France." The only trouble was he had just tasted a California wine, a Freemark Abbey wine. And there was a couple minutes later.
You must have been floored.
I was. I had to check my list 2 or 3 times to make sure that I had it right. And then a few minutes later, one of the French judges held up a glass that kind of went through the same ritual, and he said, "Ah, this must be California. It has no nose." He had just tasted a Batade Montrachet, one of France's most famous wines. So they were confused. Clearly, these eminent judges that day could not tell the difference, in the white wine category in particular, between the French wines and the California.
Okay, so now let's push this fast forward for a second. Now, the tasting ends, as you said earlier in the show, that California Red, California White beat out the French Red and White as the 2 number 1 wines in those categories.
Right.
What did the judges do when they realized what they had done?
Well, they announced the results of the white wine category before they tasted the reds.
Okay.
And in the white wine categories, it was a runaway victory for California. Every single one of the judges had selected as his or her favorite number one wine, a California wine.
And that was?
Well, 6 of the 9 had just selected Chateau Montelena Chardonnay, which is from the Napa Valley. And 3 of them had selected Chalon, which is from the Santa Cruz mountain area. It was the Chateau Montelena came in first, and it was, as I say, it was a runaway victory for California. Stephen Spurrier thinks that because of that, the French judges were determined not to let a California wine win the red category as well. This has been, I mean, there's been a scandal.
Yeah.
To have 1. It would have been a revolution to have 2.
Right.
So if you look. So in the mood of the red wine tasting was very different than it had been for the white wine tasting.
Now they became serious.
Now they became serious. And in their comments to each other, they were usually dead on. So at one moment, Christian Vaniquet, the head sommelier at the Tour d'Argent restaurant, took a sip of a wine and he said, "That's a Mouton. I don't know what I'm doing here." And I looked at my list, and he was right. He had just tasted a Chateau Mouton Rothschild, which is again is top of the word. It's a French first growth. Then and there were similar comments like that. But at the end of the day, when the scores were announced, by only a point and a half, Stag's Leap Wine Cellars, Cabernet Sauvignon from 1973, had beat out the Mouton, actually came in second, and was the victor that day. It was the Judgment of Paris.
So the French judges, did they realize the ramifications of this event to the world and to France? I
think there was only one judge who did, and I didn't talk to her about that, but from her actions...
she had a sense.
She had a sense, and she was the editor of the Revue de Vin de France. And I think she had a sense that something really important had just happened, because she came up to Spurrier and said, "Can I have my scorecards back?"
And he said...
He said, "No, they aren't your scorecards, they're my scorecards." And then they got into one of these great debates that only an Englishman and a Frenchman or a French woman could have over who owned the scorecards. And he insisted they were hers because he was staging the event. And she said, no, but it was my scores. And so finally she gave up at the end, and he gave the scores to a summer intern and said, "Take these back to the wine shop immediately before somebody tries to change their scores." Because I think, again, the lady is now dead, so I may be making unkind remarks about her. My guess is she wanted to get those scorecards back so she could change her scores, and she could change history a little bit.
So let's get now to where we are today. So you decided to write an article, and the article was written in Time magazine.
Right.
And the bottom line, only because time's going to run out soon, the bottom line is, what did your article state?
It said this had been, an interesting event. It was called, the title of the article was Judgment of Paris. And it just said, it was not a long story. It was less than a column in length and didn't have a picture accompanying it, which is, that's the sign of an important story, is when you have a picture next to it. So it didn't get great play, but it got great play in the American public when people started reading it. And then it was picked up by all sorts of other publications. The New York Times, for Frank Preil, who was a wine writer of the New York Times, did the following 2 weeks, he did stories on the Judgment of Paris tasting, because it really was clearly going to be an important event.
Mm-hmm. So now, what is the aftermath? Because your book gets into such great detail. You go into who the different wineries were that were involved, that were represented at the Judgment of Paris tasting. And you talk about the history of each of the wineries. You talk about the history of as California as well as France. And then you go into the players, for lack of a better word, the people, who were actively involved in this. And you especially spend a lot of time with Mike Grgich in the book, who made the wine at the time, for Chateau Montelena, who now has Grgich Hills. And then you also spent time talking about Warren Winiarski from Stag's Leap Wine Cellar. And you go into just a whole history and story. You could smell the must. You could smell the grapes and everything. That's how good it was written. But what I find interesting, though, is that you didn't leave it there. You then carried it to today. You took everyone, the reader, all around the world. Tell us, what has been, in your opinion, the aftermath of May 24th, 1976? What influence has happened around the world?
I think it really started the globalization of wine. As I said earlier in the program, before the Paris tasting, France was on a pedestal and everybody else was making plunk. And then everybody, in effect, got inspired. So what I decided to do was literally go around the world. And I looked for wineries that had some kind of connection to the Paris tasting. Mm-hmm. I went to New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Chile. I went to Oregon because the white wine that came in fourth at Paris tasting, Drouhin Drouhin, right. The daughter of the winemaker there is now making wine in Oregon. And so there's this cross-fertilization of wine that started really at the Paris tasting when winemakers said, hey, we can do it as well. And today, there is this globalization of wine. Now, there's some people who don't like the globalization of wine. Mm-hmm. I think the globalization of wine has been the greatest thing that has ever happened to the wine consumer. Mm-hmm. Never before in history has so much great wine been available at such attractive prices as it is today.
That's true. That is absolutely true. I remember in the 60s, you only had on your table either the French wines, or then you had a Matousse, or a Brillanti or something like that. But for the most part, you really didn't have the plethora of the magnificent, reasonable priced wines today that you do have. There's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. I think you go into a wine store today and you have such a selection. Australia, New Zealand. I mean, I said in the book, and I really do believe it, I think the best Sauvignon Blanc, which is a wine made in Bordeaux, originally from Bordeaux, but the best Sauvignon Blanc today is made in New Zealand.
I'm with you.
And it's just outstanding. The conditions for making the wine just come together best in New Zealand.
And it's a totally different wine because that wine has essence of passion fruit, and sometimes the acidity can be bracing, or if you let it age a little bit, some of the braciness, if that's a word, comes down, and then you wind up with this marvelous passion fruit flavor. I told you I had spent some time with Kevin Judd from Cloudy Bay. And
I saw Kevin when I was doing the book.
I'm going to email him and tell him that you were with me today. And his wines, they're just sublime. They're just terrific. You have done such a marvelous justice to the Judgment of Paris experience to let people understand what exactly is happening and what has gone on and where it is today. You go back into history. This book took you, what did you say, 5 to 6 years to write?
I really worked on it for about 6 years, yeah.
It's amazing. And the traveling around the world.
Three trips to France alone.
That's just amazing. But through your book, I became associated or friends with Mike Grgich, who was the winemaker who made the Chardonnay from Chateau Montelena, who now has his own winery.
Yeah, it was a direct result of the Paris tasting that he, in effect, got his own winery. Well, only a year after, because he'd been working for Chateau Montelena as a winemaker there. A year after the Paris tasting, he broke ground on his own winery in California. It's great, it's a great success story. Mike arrived in the United States, or he arrived in Canada because he couldn't get into the United States.
Tell us where he came from.
He came from Croatia.
Okay.
He had $32 hidden in the seal of in the sole of his shoe. He left Croatia with $32 in his shoe.
And how about his English?
English was hardly existent.
Okay, so this man really...
Absolutely.
He set out.
Oh, I mean, he worked as a janitor in Canada before. He had been a winemaker. He'd grown up. They'd made wine at home, and he'd grown up, and he'd studied winemaking in Croatia. But he escaped the communist-dominated Croatia at that point, which was part of Yugoslavia, first to go to Germany, then to Canada, and finally landed in California and worked for several other people. But as a result of the Paris tasting, Austin Hills of the Hills Brothers family foundation company came to him and said, why don't we go into business together? I'll bring the money and you bring the winemaking.
Right. Fascinating story. When I speak to him on the phone, he is a humble individual. I mean, he's achieved incredible success. Now his clothing and the wines are in the Smithsonian.
Yes.
For the exhibit with Warren Winiarski from Stag's Leap Wine Cellars to show how the United States won the Judgment of Paris.
Yeah. In the permanent collection of the Smithsonian Library is a bottle of the winning red wine and the winning white wine from the Paris tasting. The only bottle of wine in the Smithsonian collection.
Oh, is that right? Is that right? I just think it's amazing. Where do you see the future now? Since the genie is out of the bottle, and now the rest of the world says, hey, you know, the emperor's not wearing any clothes. I mean, we can do this too. And now, indeed, I mean, you look in Australia at Grange, for example, or we can have this discussion all day about great wines that are made around the world, as you alluded to before earlier with New Zealand, and on and on. Where do you see what's going to happen with all this?
I think one of the things that's happening is that we are conquering. There's been a full frontal attack on what might be considered the last failure in the making of wine. And the last failure in making of wine is what is called cork taint. And that's going to be the subject of
your
my next book.
So you're writing another book, and it's going to be all about...
It's going to be about what some people have called the Great Cork Debate. Because in the last 10, 15 years, in a very intense way, there has been a challenge to the whole problem of what is called cork taint. There is a chemical compound that gets into some wines in a variety of ways. It comes from faulty corks, but also it can come from the wine rays, not just through the corks. But this chemical compound can spoil the taste of wine.
And you won't get that with a screw cap.
You won't. There are various ways that people are now investigating of how to get around the point. First of all, the first attempt were what are called plastic stoppers, or synthetic corks, which are made out of plastic, so that you have the romance of the cork. You get to pull a cork, but it's not made of cork. That
man-made materials.
It's man-made materials. More recently, you have screw tops, which are coming on very strong, and now you even have out of Germany and Austria a totally new type of closure.
Tell me.
That is made out of glass.
That's fascinating.
It's a glass stopper that goes into the bottle, and you pop it, and it comes out very easily.
Can you have any romance with it, or is it very clinical?
Well, it's very clinical, but it has an elegance because it's glass. Okay. You have glass on glass. And one of the points of history that's very interesting, and I have discovered this already in the research, is that in the 1820s, Chateau Lafite, again, one of the great wines of France,
of the world,
was made with a glass stopper. So cork has been in existence for 400 years. It has been since the early 1600s. And now it's been challenged like no time before. The cork industry is not just walking away from this very important market. They are doing things, and they're very active trying to clean up their act, clean up their corks. And so it's going to be a race to see, in fact, who's going to win. Is cork going to continue? And I think that is probably going to be the next great story in the wine industry, because it's the last problem. You know, if you go back to the middle of the 19th century when Louis Pasteur did all of his great work, the Frenchman, you know, he did all the first early work on what makes wine great and what makes wine fail. And since from then to the present, wine has been made better and better and better. The one thing, though, that was still a problem was the cork, and that cork taint. That it's nobody knows exactly what percentage of wine bottles are corked. There are estimates that it goes as high as 10%.
10%, that's what I heard.
Yeah,
a number as high as that.
But the cork, believe me, the cork industry knows this, and they're doing a lot.
I got to tell you that I am totally convinced that, first, anybody listening is saying, give me a break. A book all about cork, come on. Knowing you, having read your book, having spoken with you countless times on the phone, emailing you, I know that you're going to take a subject like this and make it, again, compelling, interesting, informative, and knowledge. You're a great writer, and I really want you to know that. And I say this right here on television because I really enjoyed what you have done. Now, before the show is over, I want you to sign a book for me. You put it right here in the front, and that I appreciate having you on the show. And then after that, I have another book that I want you to be able to sign as well, and that will be to my nephew, who is also he's a TV producer out in Los Angeles, and his name is Mark Abrams, M-A-R-C, and he is going to appreciate this. He doesn't know I'm doing this, so when I come out to visit him, I'm going to hand him the book, and he will absolutely just appreciate this tremendously. So you're an absolute gentleman for doing this.
Harvey, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. It's a passionate subject, as you can tell.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let me just hold up the book so that the folks at home can get a chance to see, because I even love the way the book looks, and it's just great. I mean, you've got it right on the wine bottle there, and if we pull out a little bit more, good, everybody can see this. And I think it's great, Judgment of Paris. Did you use that title basically because of the historical significance before this in
mythology? I did, but also because it was the title of the Time magazine story. But the Time magazine story knew the historic significance of it, and I find that when people hear the title, if they smile, I know they know the story of the myth.
Right.
And if they don't, then it's also an interesting title.
Are you happy with what you've done? You've opened up. You've opened up some wounds and you've opened up some joys, because let's see, a few weeks ago I had dinner with the managing director of Chateau Palma from Margaux, and we sat down at a very lovely restaurant. You met the owner of the restaurant earlier, and we sat down there, and I also had a gentleman who is liaison from Champagne, and he came here, and both of them were on my show earlier in the day. When we had dinner, I brought up your book. And let me tell you, they knew precisely what I was talking about, and immediately, well, it is not so, because you see, the wines that were tasted at the time, the French wines were supposed to age a little bit. They were not made to be drunk at the time, but then we had your wine, which did not need the same kind of aging, and it was amazing. It was amazing. It was like throwing salt on the wounds.
Yeah.
So...
Well, the French, as I said, the French were shocked, horror, and mad after the event, and some of them have never really gotten over it. 3 of the judges refused to talk to me for the book.
Oh.
As one of them said, it's still too painful.
It's still too painful.
Fortunately, several of the other ones did, and one of them, Christian Vanequet, who from the Tour d'Argent, in fact, he lost his job. Because of that? Because of the book, because of the tasting. He was fired by Claude Terhaille, who was the
Unbelievable. Unbelievable. We're out of time. Will you come back for the other book when it's finished?
Sure, I promised it.
Absolutely. You got to keep me informed as to what's going on. We'll email each other at times, and we'll certainly get together for some wine and dinner. George Tabor, put it right there, pal.
Great.
You're terrific.
Thank you very much.
You're a great author. You're a gentleman, and you're truly knowledgeable, and one can learn something from you. That's the bottom line that I could say here right now. I certainly have. Thank you.
Sure.
And I hope that you've learned something from George M. Tabor. Get his book. It's great. I loved it. Terrific. You'll learn an awful lot about the world of wine and the cultural aspects of it as well. So, as I always say, Dr. Harvey Passes, wishing you the best of everything, and whatever you do, please, as George said earlier, do it with passion. Toast.